Welcome to Elmo's World Podcast. It's awesome to be here again, and I have an interview with my friend, the Muslim Theist. You can find his Facebook page on Facebook, the Muslim Theist. Hey, bro, can you give us some information or tell us something about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, I have a little Facebook page. That's kind of I write sometimes, and a friend of mine actually sent me one of your past interviews with Tom Jump, and I thought it was nice. So when you invited me on, I decided to say, why not? Why let's have a conversation.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, being the Muslim theist, though, I think that you are willing to defend both Islam and theism because that's like the position you decided to take.
I mean, I don't like the framing of like, okay, I'm just here to defend a particular viewpoint. Like if I'm talking to someone and they make a good point, I'm willing to be like, okay, that's a good point. I haven't thought of like, I have to think about that. I think too many people that kind of panic as soon as their worldview is challenged to like, think, okay, I have to defend this. I have to, like, you can't evolve. And I don't have that perspective at all. My perspective is, we having a conversation, it's a give and a take. If I'm wrong about something, if there's something I don't know, then that's an opportunity for me to grow. And I'm not just going to, dial myself into a position from the get-go. Right now, okay, thus far, the position, the worldview that makes the most sense to me is Islam. As a worldview, I'm satisfied with it as compared to other worldviews that I'm observing. The other major competitor I view to be atheism, particularly scientific materialism, something like that. But I think that worldview is inconsistent in many ways. And so what I'm left with is theism, right? And out of those, then you kind of go through Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, the major theisms, and you kind of narrow it down from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And well, you said a lot of things like, for example, you claim that atheism is an inconsistent worldview. Okay. That's something that we have to look into. But one other thing, though, the process you explained is that you move from deism, then theism, then Islam, then this is where this is the position you've taken. Am I right?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay. Well, I want to talk about the inconsistencies of atheism first, because I think that when you explain that, that can bring us to the process of or move into deism. So, Why do you think that atheism is an inconsistent worldview?
So first of all, here's the thing. We have to distinguish between kind of an atheist ontology and an atheist epistemology. And obviously there's many different kinds of atheists, right? But one thing they typically share in their epistemology is a skepticism, okay? The first problem that I've consistently encountered with atheists is this, that they have a very particular high standard of skepticism, which they'll apply to theism because, they don't like it as a worldview. Right, let's
Yeah.
say. And I'm not saying they necessarily are just doing what they don't like, but they're arguing against that worldview. So they're going to have a particular, very high standard. Then, as soon as you ask them about their beliefs, right? So again, atheism doesn't necessarily entail a particular worldview, but in the sense that like you can be, I don't know, a libertarian or a communist or whatever. Like there's many different shades, but you'll be like, okay, what is your value system? For instance, okay, I believe in freedom. I believe in freedom of speech. I believe that, we can have objective morality. I believe this, I believe that. And then you're asking them, okay, how is this consistent with you a second ago telling me that, well, maybe there could be logical contradictions that exist in the world. Well, quantum mechanics tells us that, there's one interpretation in which, a contradiction can exist. So I'm like, okay, so if you're applying that level of skepticism, where you're telling me even basic laws of logic are open to question, where is it that you're getting off talking about morality and politics and this, and you're talking about who to vote for and whatever? It's like, dude, you're telling me that the law of non-contradiction doesn't exist. So actually, we should vote for both Biden and Trump, right? Because apparently contradictions can exist, right? So there's no. This is one problem that I find with atheism, is that there's that lack of consistency just in terms of how the dialogue is proceeding. They don't say, okay, now that I've accepted the premise that the law of non-contradiction is in question, what follows from that? And they don't realize the absurdity that follows from that, and how you can just arbitrarily now pull out the, well, maybe logic doesn't work card on literally any debate at any time. And they're simply like selectively doing it, right? And I'm not saying that atheists realize this, but it is something that to point out. So that's one. The other is, okay, on the actual level of, like, let's say ontology, right? So this is going to apply to a very particular kind of atheist, which is what you might call like a scientific materialist. Okay, so the methodological naturalism or naturalism in general. What you end up with is a lot of problems with it. Okay, so for instance, you have the hard problem of consciousness. This is a direct refutation of materialism. What materialists will normally say is, look, we know it looks bad, okay, that here we're saying everything is material, but then you have this one thing, which, by the way, is actually the most undeniable thing. Even if you take a skeptical methodology like Descartes, you're more justified in like denying the external world exists than denying your own consciousness, right? So, okay, we have this undeniable thing here, and it appears to be immaterial by all accounts, because, for instance, material things don't have certain properties, right? Like, for example, intentionality. Material things are not directed towards something. Consciousness is directed and pointed towards something. Just as an example, and there's many different properties that philosophers of mind will list. Okay, so we're looking at this, and matter and mind appear to have two totally different sets of properties. But you know what? Don't worry, we'll be able to explain this, 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years from now, maybe. Right, that's kind of the position they take. And to me, I'm like, okay, but working with the data you have now, right, the rational position is to abandon materialism, because it looks like an insoluble problem. So why would you put your entire worldview on this cart? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So this is one of the other. There's more problems, like, for example, Alvin Plantinga's argument about how. And by the way, I haven't flushed out the hard problem of consciousness as well as I should, because once you get into like the nitty gritty details, you're going to see like all the different responses the atheists have and how none of them really hold up. And then you have the problem, once again, it seems that, like consistency needs to be key here. If you're going to tell me, okay, we have a theory, the theory of evolution, this is our story, this is our meta narrative. Okay, so if the theory of evolution is true, then that would basically mean that you have no reason to believe that your mental faculties can actually arrive at the truth, because they're designed simply to help you survive. And surviving and truth are two different things. If I think there's a pink elephant behind me and that causes me to dodge a tiger, then I have survived, but I was completely wrong. It wasn't a pink elephant behind me, it was a tiger. But in both instances, I ran out of the way, and so I'm saved. So likewise, we would have no reason to think any of our beliefs are actually truth-oriented. We would only have the idea that our beliefs are survival-oriented, and therefore your belief in naturalism itself, your belief in the theory of evolution itself, is self-defeating. It's self-refuting. So those are just a couple of the problems.
Okay, cool. But I guess then to unpack that all, you mean to say that in terms of the worldview of atheism, it has as many problems as in any theist worldview. Am I correct? Especially on the ontology, the consciousness, evolution, everything that they claim and hold to be self-evidently true are actually very hard to produce and to be certain of, right?
It's not merely that. It's a consistency issue.
It's
simply that.
Yeah.
Like with theism, you can hammer out a fairly consistent worldview. Okay.
Okay. In terms of
hammer out a
consistency,
consistent worldview.
Yeah. In terms of consistency,
for them, they
though,
can't do that. They always have to switch their standard, and they have to switch their discourse depending on what they're talking about. Their politics is not in line with their ethics. Their ethics is not in line with their ontology. Their ontology is not in line with their epistemology.
Yeah,
with
I get what you're
theism,
saying.
you can get everything lined up from your epistemology down to your ethics and your politics.
But in terms of like consistency, I think that there are a lot of atheists who ground their politics on a materialistic worldview. especially, and that, for example, when they discuss ethics, they take into account that there is no objective morality. They take into account that there is no God, and they take into account existentialism and nihilism, and they include this in their moral principles. How would you account for that?
So look, there is a spectrum, and there are atheists that are more consistent, and there are atheists that are less consistent.
Okay,
Okay,
okay.
but so there is a spectrum. But what I'm saying is ultimately, like if you accept, for instance, that there is that all there is matter. Okay, and purpose is a mental property. Okay, it's a
Mm-hmm.
property of consciousness, and consciousness ultimately is just matter.
Mm-hmm.
What that means is there is no purpose, there is no objective
Yeah,
purpose. So
yeah.
on what basis now are you coming to prescribe an ethics and implement it?
Yeah, so in a way,
You see?
I've discussed this on my debate with John Anthony. Yeah, that when I said that atheism ultimately entails nihilism. It's is that sort of what you're saying, that in terms of what kind of purpose we can derive from a materialistic worldview, it's purely subjective.
That and so I'm saying something beyond that, which is
Mm-hmm.
this. If I ask the atheist, okay, on what basis did you actually reject the existence of God? And they told me, well, because in quantum mechanics it's possible that there can exist non-contradictions, right? So
Mm-hmm.
once you now accepted that principle, what I'm saying is, okay, you got to carry that over into now your discussion of politics. If it's possible that the principle of
I
non-contradiction is true,
disagree.
how are you even
I
why do you
disagree
say that? Go ahead.
because you know the quantum realm works in differently logically in terms of that, and I think that a lot of theists also claim that the law of non-contradiction doesn't work the same way in the quantum realm. So it would actually be the same for a theist. So I see no difference, and I don't think that's a good argument though. So are you saying that in the quantum realm it also follows the three laws of logic, that it
What I'm
works?
saying is, yeah, right now they have, and again, physics isn't my field, but as far as my understanding goes, they have different interpretations of the same data. Okay,
Okay.
because there are limitations in terms of the kinds of experiments they can do in quantum mechanics, because obviously you're dealing with something at such a small level that you have things like the measurement problem, which is whenever they're trying to
Mm-hmm.
measure something, they affect the system they're trying to measure, and so therefore it becomes difficult to choose between competing theories because they're limited
Mm-hmm.
in terms of their ability to experiment. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so if you have multiple competing interpretations,
Mm-hmm.
one of which implies that the law of non-contradiction is false,
Mm-hmm.
and you have a dozen others that don't require you to give up the law of non-contradiction. The logical thing to do, okay, the rational thing to do is to say the theory which implies that the law of non-contradiction is false is the wrong theory. It's one of the consistent theories, one of the theories that makes
Well,
sense. That's the correct theory.
that's a
Because as soon as
huge
you,
claim though.
it's not really. It's not really, because the entire scientific method is based on the law of non-contradiction. So whenever you do an experiment in science, you have two hypotheses, the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis, and one has to be the logical
I
negation of the other.
disagree. I disagree. I don't think that's what the scientific method is. The scientific method doesn't hold any position on metaphysics or ontology. It's just a process by which you can make sure that what you hold, what the theories you make is plausible. You know, the models you work with are actually active, but it doesn't have any presupposed metaphysics or rules. But yeah.
I wasn't saying that. I wasn't saying the outcomes of science. I'm talking about the method itself. The method itself presupposes the law of non-contradiction.
I disagree
So,
though. I don't think so.
well, sure, we can look at the scientific method. It's to make a hypothesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's step one. And then after that, there's a bunch of steps. I forgot it now because we learned it when I was in school. But basically, you design an experiment, then you have your observations, then you have your analysis, blah blah blah. So there's like 7 steps or whatever, at least the
Mm-hmm.
basic way that they teach it
Mm-hmm.
in school. And I'm saying at step one,
Mm-hmm.
formulating a hypothesis. Okay, that requires the law of non-contradiction because, and any scientist working in the field knows this, whenever you do an experiment and you design a hypothesis, you also mention two hypotheses, the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. So the one will be a logical negation of the other. So like, for example, my hypothesis is that, when I put this liquid into the beaker, it's going to turn yellow, for instance. The null hypothesis is going to be the opposite of that. It is not the case that when I put this liquid in the beaker, it's going to turn yellow.
Mm-hmm.
You see, so one is it's going to turn yellow. The other is it is not the case that is going to turn yellow. One is a negation of the other. One is A, the other is not A. You see, so
Yeah, but
because that's what they're doing.
I guess in the process, but in terms of observing and experimenting, I don't think that they would presuppose anything. I think that someone who actually uses the actual scientific method would only deem to be consistent with what they observe and whatever conclusions they derive from their observation, their data set. I think that's what they will use to formulate their theories and hypotheses.
No, but what I'm saying is the very formulation of a hypothesis or theory requires the law of non-contradiction to make sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
That when they're formulating the hypothesis, when they're even doing the experiment, when they're reaching the conclusion, like how did we even get to quantum mechanics? If you're going to tell me, well, we can have theories that allow contradictions, why did we even give up Newtonian mechanics and go for the theory of relativity? You could have just said, no, Newtonian mechanics is true. We just allow for contradictions, which means that when the light is bending around the thing and our equations doesn't make sense, well, we'll just say it's a contradiction, and now all of our theories work. Because as soon as you allow a contradiction in mathematics, you can prove anything. And so every formula that you can ever come up with for anything, you're already set because you allowed for a contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm saying?
Okay.
So once you allow that kink in the system, what I'm saying is it has massive reverberations, which you have to be cognizant of, you have to be aware of, and you have to account for. And so, at the very least, it's going to have massive effects on your epistemology and your metaphysics. And what I'm saying is that's inevitably going to kick down into your ethics.
In a way, also, I think what you mean also is that any theist who would hold that the law of non-contradiction doesn't work in the quantum realm would also be inconsistent if in their worldview, if in that case.
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, other than that, I guess that in terms of inconsistency, or incoherence, I think it would be very, very wrong to claim that any worldview is already coherent in itself, because I think that coherence requires like a sort of omniscience or a totality on the information it has. And so far as we know, we don't have that. We don't have omniscience. We don't have totality of knowledge. And so, whatever model or worldview someone has, it will always simply be dependent on the current information that we have. And so, I don't think that there are any coherent worldview right now. What do you think?
I think that you can have a coherent worldview given the data that you have available. That's one. So, for example, if we all know, like, let's say, 20 letters of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, all the way up to like Q, for example, then there can be a consistent way of understanding A to Q, and there can be an inconsistent way of understanding A to Q, putting all the data pieces together. As for the 6 remaining letters of the alphabet or whatever, you're right. Maybe one of those contradicts the system, but the point is that you're working with what you have. That's point one. Point two is that there are certain demonstrations, for example, that don't require additional information. So, for instance, no one's going to come and say, well, look, once we discover more about the universe, 1 + 1 is going to equal 5, right? 1 + 1 is going to equal 2. And so because of that, you can kind of build more secure beliefs versus some beliefs you're like, yeah, you know what, this is open to change. But some beliefs you're going to be like, no, this is pretty solid.
I guess what you're saying is that deduction is as important as induction, I guess, especially in making a worldview.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you? Well, I hope that you can start building your foundations on why you believe in God and how it led to Islam.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, there's a personal side to it, and just in terms of like, growing up, and like I was a Muslim growing up in the West, right? And what I noticed was that there was a lot of things that, that as Muslims we believe that is in sharp contrast with what society around me is believing and practicing, right? And so that leads you at a young age to be like, okay, well, what's going on here? Like, who's right? Because some things you can kind of like fit, but then there's, like if you're trying to fit something into like a round, what's a round peg into a square hole or whatever, or the opposite, right? So eventually there's things that don't fit, and that's going to lead you on a path of questioning. And I think a lot of young Muslims face that path in the West, at least thinking Muslims. And so that's kind of where that led me to. Now, again, I'm not coming on here to pretend like, I have researched every single issue and like, I'm prepared to like write my, 30 volume philosophical treatise in which I'm going to show, I'm saying this is where I've reached at this point with the research I've done, is that yes, belief in God does make sense, right? And the argument that I find most convincing is Ibn Sina's contingency argument. So the basic idea of that argument is something like this: that you can have, a being is either going to be dependent on another for its existence, or it's not going to be dependent on another for its existence, right? So now we start off with the premise simply that something exists, just something. It could be my own mind, it could be just bundles of thoughts, whatever it is, whatever that thing is that exists. You ask of it, okay, is this thing that exists, is it going to be, does it depend on something else, or does it not depend on something else? If it depends on something else, then you say, okay, well, that thing, is it dependent or independent? Right. And so if it's dependent, then again, you ask that same question: is it dependent or independent? And so you kind of follow a chain. And what you want to get to is an independent foundation for the rest of reality. Right. And so when you get there, you're going to have basically a couple of options to try and get a worldview in which all you have are dependent beings. One is a circular dependency: A depends on B, B depends on A, which doesn't make sense because it implies either that, like, let's say A is depending on B and B is depending on A. That implies that A depends on itself. Okay, A depends on A, which either is incoherent because it means that A has to be prior to itself, or it would mean something like A is actually just independent, in which case what's the need for B? Right? So it'd mean one of those two things. The other thing is that, okay, this chain keeps going and then you have, it terminates at a certain point, and then you just have the first being that is dependent, but it just popped out of nowhere. Okay? And this is like David Hume's scenario. And what I would say is that, okay, that first being that just popped out of nowhere, is it dependent or is it independent? If you tell me it's dependent, okay, then there has to be something, by definition, there has to be something that it depends on. So it's a logical contradiction to say it just popped out of nowhere. An independent being can pop out of nowhere, no problem, right? But if you're going to tell me a dependent being, what you've said is in the definition, there has to be something else that is depending on it. It doesn't just pop out of nowhere. You see? And then the third option is going to be an infinite regress. And again, I'm just going through this very quickly. Maybe there's some objections in your mind that you can present. The third option is going to be basically that an infinite set of dependent beings. And at that point, what you'd ask is, okay, this entire set of dependent beings, is it itself dependent or independent? If it's independent, no problem. We move on to the next stage of the argument, which talks about the qualities of an independent being. And if it's dependent, then you ask, okay, what is it dependent on? If that thing itself is dependent, that's impossible because it has to be part of that set, because we just said the set of all dependent beings. And so what you're left with, basically, in a nutshell, is you have to bottom out in an independent being. Do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I'm very familiar with with like the contingency argument, but please go on. I'm all right with that.
Right. So the last scenario, okay, so you have the set of all dependent beings. This set is infinite. It has to be dependent on it's either it's independent, in which case we move on, or it's not dependent. Okay. So then the question becomes, okay, so you've gotten us to an independent being, but something that someone like Tom Jump might say is, okay, yeah, we have an independent being. It is naturalistic pantheism, right? It's just the matter at the end that's going to be, or some kind of energy, or some kind of whatever that's going to be at the bottom that's not God. Okay. Now the thing is, that's only going to work if you believe that consciousness is reducible to matter. Okay. If you don't believe that consciousness is reducible to matter, meaning that consciousness is a fundamental property of reality, okay, then you have to give an account for the origin of consciousness, an irreducible account, meaning that consciousness is not reducing into something. Consciousness has to be there at the foundation. You see, because it's gonna kick up, right? What is the ultimate? What is the consciousness is depending on ultimately? Okay. And so when you follow the chain of dependency, what you're going to get is that ultimately you're going to have consciousness dependent on something which itself has consciousness. Otherwise, where does consciousness come from? It's just literally going to pop out of nowhere. Does that make sense? So that's basically how you get to a conscious independent being. And then you also get that the independent being has to be one and not many, because if, for instance, you have many independent beings, then the problem is that you ask, okay, so these many independent beings, okay, they have to be different than each other in some way. Because when I say that, for instance, there are two books and not one book, what that means is that the two books in some way differ. Okay, either they're going to be the same book, like the same title and everything, but in two different spatial locations, or they're going to be one book, two totally different books. Like, one book is called, I don't know, the Quran one is going to be the Bible, for instance, right? So those are two totally different books. The other could be like two copies of the Bible, but just in different spatial locations. Like one is in my right hand, one is in my left hand. So what you end up with is basically that when you're saying two, by definition, there has to be something different. And I'm not saying that something that has to be space or time. It could be, whatever. Some string theories say that there's like 32 dimensions to reality. Maybe there's an infinite number of, or a near infinite number of dimensions to reality. But I'm saying in some way, logically, there has to be a distinction between independent being A and independent being B. Okay, and so when you get there, you're like, okay, so if there's some difference between them, that means you have parts, because there's a part of them that's similar, which is causing them to both be independent beings. And there's a part of them that's different, which is the part where A becomes A and B becomes B. So once you have that, the problem is any whole is dependent on its parts. Okay, any whole is dependent on its parts. If I have a book is going to be dependent on the pages, and like the cover and the form of a book for it to be called a book. And so likewise, when I now have an independent being which has something similar to the other independent being, but something different which makes it A and not B, what you end up with is a composite, and a composite is always going to be dependent on its parts, and so therefore neither are going to be a true independent being. So if you have a true independent being, it's going to have to be perfectly simple. By which I mean non-composite. Some atheists, they make this memes about, oh, God is so simple or whatever, and I'm just like, you know what we mean by that? We mean not composite, not made of parts. That's it, So that's kind of a summary of it.
I guess that you believe that in absolute divine simplicity, I guess, similar to what the Platonics or Aristotle would claim.
Yeah, I'm a fan of divine simplicity.
Okay. Yeah, well, I don't like it, but fine. Then,
because it causes problems for Christians. That's why. Once you accept divine simplicity, you're like, okay, wait, how am I going to fit a Trinity in here, right? And so that's actually, this argument is itself one of the reasons why I find Christianity hard to stomach.
But the Ashari would say differently. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean they can say differently, and they have their arguments, but even they will say something like what's a good translation for that? Like the thing itself, like God himself is perfectly simple, but his attributes are not, something along those lines. In other words, that you can have a perfectly simple being that has attributes which are not parts of that being. They're simply like kind of added on attributes. Okay. So they have ways to kind of like try to explain that,
Okay.
which you can take up with them.
Okay. Well, other than that, I think that there are a lot of other arguments to prove that God exists, So in a way, what you're doing is you use logic and induction and all these, basically thinking about a metaphysics, and that's how you came upon your belief in God.
More or less, yeah. Like what I gave here is basically like a summary version, but if I were talking to an atheist, he would challenge me on like 70 different points in that whole summary. And like I've done the back and forth where I'm like, okay, so what do you say about, and then I go back and forth and work it down. And what I found is that the only solution to the logical problem that I've presented is to say that there's an independent being. And then the way that you get consciousness is very simple, by showing that materialism is false, and it's going to kick up the problem of consciousness all the way back to the origin, and you're going to get it from there. And so once you've put those two together, I find that makes a perfectly coherent worldview.
Okay, then let's talk about how an absolutely divine and simple being led you to Islam. Why would that happen?
Yeah. So look, when we talk about how, for instance, how do you know Islam is true, for instance? So how do we know anything at all, right? There's basically three modes of knowing that I can, see, and that many other epistemologists would agree with, which is intuition, deduction, and induction. Okay, so intuition is things that appear in your consciousness directly, that you can directly grasp. For instance, your knowledge of your own thoughts. Deduction is things that you kind of prove using logic, using deductive logic, and induction are things that you probabilistically determine to be true, and sometimes the probability builds up to such a point that like there's no way it could be false. So for instance, my knowledge of the existence of Siberia, which I've never been to, is based on induction, and I'm 100% certain, or 99.9999% certain that the whole world is not lying and that Siberia actually does exist. So with Islam, okay, in the same way that for the existence of God, you can have proof on those three levels. So one way I know that God exists is through intuitive, through direct experience. The second is through deductive proof. And the third is through an inductive proof, meaning looking around me and determining that this world would have required a creator. Similarly, we apply all three of those arguments to any religion. Okay, so you have at the experiential level. Okay, the experiential level. Do I feel a connection with a divine being, which I've now proven exists, right? I've now proven God exists. So does this religion now provide you with an experience of that? Okay, if so, that is a very good confirmation. That's a good reason to believe that your religion, at least in some ways, I'm not saying it has to be 100% true, but there is a divine spark, you can say. There's something revealed about the religion that you're currently in. Okay. The second is deductively. So deductive proof can only get you so far, but the way Muslim theologians traditionally did this is they would say something like, okay, well, when we analyze the properties of the divine, we find that the divine has to have all of the perfections of existence. This is the way they put it, existential perfections, one of which is wisdom. Okay, and because God is wise, he must have sent communication to human beings who are ignorant and do not know the full purpose of their creation. First of all, he must have created them with a purpose. And then second of all, he has to tell them what the purpose of their creation is. And so therefore, he must have sent some means to tell them what their purpose in creation is. Part of that is going to be natural revelation, so what you find in your own self, in your own heart. Part of it is going to be what you observe in nature, about the nature of society in the universe and all of that. But there is a gap which requires messengers from God to come and tell us what God's will is and what our purpose in life is. Okay, that's the second. And then the third way is going to be inductively. So this would be like looking at the claimants to prophecy or to divine revelation, and to examine their life and to examine their doctrine, and to therefore infer that this person is truthful or not. So that's basically a summary.
Well, it's I think that you've jumped a lot of there, especially when it comes to that on your premises that because God is wise and that humans are ignorant, and that He should have had like sent the revelation. That's a huge uh, claim there, and it's not that I disagree, but how do you get there? You know, like oh, I still it's not convincing though.
Sure, sure. So what first I'm going to tell you personally what I was just giving kind of a summary of the different ways, not personally what I find the most convincing. So I'm going to try to explain that. In terms of what I find most convincing, what I would say is this, that look, when most people, the reason why they believe in God, okay, or their particular religion is because they do have a sense of the divine, okay? They do have a sense of the divine. When they pray, they feel that connection to something higher. Now, that being the case, if you're taking like if you're starting off with the position of atheistic naturalism, right, or scientific naturalism, whatever, you can easily just be like, oh yeah, all these people are just delusional, right? Like, there's no reason to think that people's beliefs have to map onto reality. There's no reason to think that our mental faculties are anything more than what's it called? Due to evolution, basically. And it's all happening by chance. And so, yeah, billions of people around the world are just delusional. Most of mankind in history has just been delusional, and now we're rational, and so we understand there's no reason to think this. But if I give you a deductive argument now showing that actually God does exist, or I give you a very strong inductive argument showing that God does exist, now when suddenly people are telling you, I feel a connection to God, you can't dismiss it because the prior probability that all these people are, deluded is massively reduced. You now have a much, much higher prior probability that there is communication coming from the divine to mankind, because the vast majority of mankind are, have the sense of it. Furthermore, automatically, once you've proven that God exists, the probability that any religion is true goes up. I'm saying for all of them, the probability goes up compared to what it is when you have a naturalistic scientific worldview. Because we already know that the object of their worship, what they're claiming to have gotten divine revelation from, is actually there. And so you end up getting this bolster for all religions across the board. So once you have that going, what you do is you now have to work from within the religions themselves. And so I think it is a jump. In terms of the questions you were asking me, is like, okay, you went from God, how did you get to Islam? It's more specific than that. It's, okay, you got God, how do you get to a religion, or there's even any form of divine communication between God and man? Okay, and then that's going to apply equally to all religions. And then once you go there, then you go, okay, now that we've established that God even communicates to mankind, or that there is this probability that this is happening, which the religion are you going to choose out of that? So I'm putting an intermediate step here. I'm not even going to Islam. I'm just talking about all religions now. If God exists, right, we have a much higher chance of saying that any given religion is true. Any claimant to prophecy, anyone who's claiming to be a prophet, is now automatically, the probability has gone up, okay, compared to when we were in the agnostic or atheistic position. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but to me though, there are a lot of like obstacles this type of argument has to overcome. Like for example, um, why aren't we already in contact with God? Or why is why the hiddenness, you know, and stuff like that? Why does he have to use like a very very simple and hard way, and difficult way in order to for me to for his communication to 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 come to the people, you know? But why, if if he's all powerful, then why this limitation?
So is this an argument against the existence of God, or against God communicating to mankind in some way?
Against the God communicating, you know,
Right. So,
because
right.
a lot of atheists would say that if God wanted to communicate, you know, he would have just, you know, did that, and then okay, we communicated. But why? You know, it's
Sorry, you cut off for a second. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, so it was a sort of, I guess it's sort of a special pleading, I guess, in the case that God could have made a lot of other ways to communicate more efficiently, but he chose a very simple man, and that took a lot of that went into process of a lot of blood and hardship and difficulty, and was not able to actually reach the whole of humanity in his attempt to reach them with to reach all people.
Right. So if we already established the existence of God, right, then in response to that, it's always possible to say, look, uh, God has his own kind of purpose for that. But more specifically, you're actually going to have to look at the individual religions' response to that. Okay, so every religion is going to have a different answer to that exact question you just asked. And that's actually going to help us determine which religion is true, because it's going to have the more convincing answer. Okay, to that question,
Okay.
at least
Okay.
partially. Perhaps we can say that, look, God is infinite, we are finite, so we can't totally understand, but at least one that's giving a partial answer that satisfies the human
Okay.
soul
Okay.
is going to help us determine that. I'm simply saying that as an atheist, I would be comfortable totally dismissing all of mankind for all of history as being totally delusional based on my presuppositions. But once now I've accepted God exists, and I've accepted that actually purpose is an inherent part of creation and things like that, then I'm going to be looking around and being like, okay, so all of these billions of people who are claiming that, to have some sort of connection with God, all of these people are lying. When I'm looking at the literature of saints, okay, when I'm looking at the literature of someone like a Rumi or a Hafiz or a whether even it be in other religions, right? Whether it be even in other religions, non-Islamic religions, there is very clearly here a some weight to that. Inductively, I can't just dismiss it like I did when I was an atheist and be like, oh, all these people are just delusional, because I know the object of their the other side actually exists. If a communication is two ways, I've already established the other side it exists. And so when I'm looking at all these claimants to prophecy, I'm not going to automatically just be like, oh, they're all totally lunatics and whatever. No, I'm going to give some weight and be like, wait, I have to take their claim seriously. At least the major world religions, because you would think if God is going to send revelation, is going to have a major effect on the world. And so the major world religions, I would have to at least take somewhat seriously. And so what I would say is this, that the probability that all of these billions of people are delusional, right? Having the same delusion, not just delusional, but having the exact same delusion, right? That there is some sort of connection with the divine, and they're describing the divine in incredibly diverse environments with a lot of similarity. Yes, there's differences, but there's a lot of similarity. There are key features to the divine. They all are saying that the divine is infinite, that the divine is, ultimate goodness, ultimate love, ultimate whatever. Like, they're describing their connection to the divine and this mystical journey that they're going through. For me, this is convincing that there's a general, let's say you can call it general revelation. There is a general communication to mankind.
Okay. Well, let's talk about why you think Islam has the best communication, or best text from God, or in a way.
Right. The way I look at it is this, that in Islam, our worldview is actually not that the other religions are false, okay, per se. In other words, we have no problem saying that in principle, Christianity is a revelation from God. Judaism is a revelation from God. Hinduism most likely was a revelation from God. Taoism, or at least some sort of Chinese spirituality, is a revelation from God. How do we know this? Because we have a verse in the Quran which tells us that God sent prophets to every nation. So every nation received the prophet, the Native Americans, the whatever. And so therefore, Islam is not in direct competition with these other religions. What the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying is that he is the last messenger. So he is the last in a line of messengers, all of which are teaching the same essential message. And the issues that we have with the other religions is not that they are totally false to begin with. I'm talking about the major world religions, typically. It's not that they are false, like, completely. It's that there are doctrinal issues. There are specific doctrinal issues. So for instance, with Christianity, we wouldn't say that, oh, Christianity is just totally false. We'd be like, this doctrine of the Trinity, in the way that it has been understood and passed down, this specific thing is problematic. You see? So we're not throwing the whole thing out. We're not saying that the spirituality that Christians experience, that when they're praying to God, that God is just like, has his back turned, metaphorically speaking, and doesn't, communicate and show his love and whatever to all of creation, including animals, right? What we're saying is that no, these specific doctrines that you have ascribed to Jesus are problematic for the following reasons, right? And that what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is doing is he's coming and kind of clearing the air, clearing the debris, let's say, that previous prophets, when they came, the doctrines, the political manipulations, all of the problems that occur in human society, all of the things that have accumulated in these traditions, he's trying to come and give you the most pure, unadulterated version of God's message, which is going to last us until the end of time, when Judgment Day comes. So we're not in competition with other religions. What we're saying is merely that we're the last in the line of true divine religions. And that worldview makes sense to me because I don't have to deny the beauty of Christian mysticism. I don't have to deny the beauty that's found in, the Hindu ascetic tradition. I don't have to deny these things. What I simply say is that in this time period, okay, in the end times, the last communication from God has come, and it has told us very clearly that it is obligatory on us to follow the Prophet Muhammad in this time period. And so if you're following a different tradition, you need to get on board with this one, because this is the most updated message. This is the most clean message. This is what the ship that's going to land us, keep us safe in the end times.
Okay, cool. And then let's talk about whether or not Islam could have been true, or the Prophet Muhammad could have been lying, or a lunatic, or actually telling the truth.
Yeah, so I think the way I look at it is you look at the overall message, right? And you're getting a consistent worldview, right? You're getting a consistent general worldview. And for me, I see the wisdom as plain. And so this is something that I think is going to go back to people's individual research. One thing that I would warn, though, is that one thing that people try to do when measuring the truth or falsity of a prophet, okay, or of a worldview, is they compare it to moral truths they think to be true because of the environment that they grew up in, okay? So, for example, the proposition that, obviously gay marriage is okay. And so therefore, because the Prophet Muhammad was saying that gay marriage is not okay, or even homosexuality, engaging in homosexual acts in general is not okay, therefore he's a false prophet. No, but you have to be like, okay, what is the basis for this moral worldview that I have? And you have to be able to substantiate your moral worldview for you to then use that as a measuring stick. So that's one thing that I would warn against, is there's a tendency to do that. And I think most objections actually to the Prophet of Islam come from a liberal moral worldview that people have internalized, and they haven't in turn critically examined it to see whether it's even consistent, whether or not there are problems with it before then applying it.
Okay, I understand in a way. Yeah, exactly. Like, for example, like, how can I derive human rights from a materialistic worldview? It doesn't make sense and stuff. Yeah.
Right.
Mhm. Okay. Well, yeah. Please go ahead and talk about the Quran and how how it proves itself to be the word of God.
Look, what I would say is this. You'll know what's that saying of Jesus? You'll know them by their, or I don't know if it was Jesus or someone else in the Bible. Ye shall know them by their fruits, or do you know what I'm? Can you help me out here, Elmo?
Yeah, my sheep will hear when I call to them, and you will know them by their fruits. I think you're right. You're right.
All right. So you will know them by their fruits, right? So when you look at the Islamic tradition as a whole, now obviously you're talking about an entire civilization, and what I'm about to say does apply to other religions as well. Okay, and I'm going to come back to that point. When you look at the tradition as a whole, yes, you find a lot of bad things which are natural to human beings because we As a Christian, you'll sympathize with our sinful nature and all of that. That's there. But you also find a majestic, mystical tradition within Islam. Okay, a really serious mystical tradition to Islam. Okay, and what I'm saying is when you look at that on the whole, okay, when you're looking at the revelation that the prophet is coming and you're seeing this mystical tradition and the fruits that it is born, and them quoting the Quran, and I'm going to get to the Quran directly because obviously that is the greatest, that shines well above any mystical work. But I'm saying when you look at the thing as a whole, you can be fairly confident that this is a serious religion that does lead a person to God. They do lead someone to have that connection with God. Okay, now you might say, okay, well, we have the Christian mystics, we have the Hindu mystics, we have this, we have that. And I would say, yes, I agree with you. But I already addressed this when I said that Islam is not in competition with those worldviews because our issues with those worldviews are simply on doctrinal matters. We don't deny that Christianity in principle is a divine revelation, right? So our issue is just saying, look, the Trinity is the problem here. It's not the whole thing. So we can allow for that entire Christian mystical tradition without, without a serious problem. And we would say, yeah, the reason why that mystical tradition exists in Christianity is because it is a true revelation that Jesus was in fact sent by God, and he taught the disciples, and he transferred that light that was in his heart to the disciples, and those disciples transferred it to those that they taught, who transferred it to, of course, not everyone, but some of those who they taught, and eventually you have kind of a fading of the light as you typically, not necessarily for each person, but you have a fading of that light as time kind of passes, right? Until you get the revelation of Islam, which is going to stay strong, inshallah, God willing, to the day of judgment. So that's what I would say to that. Specifically the Quran, right? Specifically the Quran. Again, for me, when I read it, I feel that that mystical intuition. Okay, so we talked about 3 ways of knowing: intuition, deduction, and induction. Intuitively, I see the divine light in the text. I feel the divine light in the text. I see it with the eye of the heart, so to speak. So for me, this is a sufficient reason to be like, okay, yes, this is something that is leading me to God. Obviously, inductively, there are also arguments. For instance, you look at some of the things that are mentioned in the Quran in terms of scientific foreknowledge. So this is like science, obviously, you have certain scientific inferences and certain scientific theories that are more speculative. When you look at some of the certain scientific knowledge that we've discovered, or the more certain scientific knowledge we've discovered, you find some of that foreshadowed in the Quran, for instance. And so that's a good inductive argument to be like, okay, this is divine foreknowledge. And obviously, on each of these points, there are going to be people who would want to challenge that and, then go into the details. And for some of these arguments, not all of them, for some of them, I've really gone into the details to see, okay, what is their argument? And what I would say is this, when it comes to scientific foreknowledge, is this, that the nature of the Arabic language and the nature of a text like the Quran is that it allows for multiple interpretations, okay? If even one of the interpretations, and by the way, when I mean multiple interpretations, I mean interpretations which can plausibly be derived from the language of the text. I don't mean just being like, oh, well, this word over here, like superimposing that is, oh, it's just some metaphor for blah, 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 and just kind of flying up in the air. I'm saying, no, the actual grammar of the text, when you read it, the grammar of the text allows for multiple interpretations. The meaning of the words in the text allows for multiple interpretations, which have historically been used in the Arabic language. When you sit down and do that, if even one interpretation leads you to scientific foreknowledge, then that is counts in your favor. Why? Because there are an infinite number of sentences which could have been false. And so if you have one sentence, which even one interpretation of which gives you a true scientific foreknowledge, then that counts as good evidence. On the other hand, some people try to apply the same, be like, oh, well, you have to apply the same standard. And so if you have something that is scientifically false, right, then that should be, you should look at the Quran as well in that light. And what I would say is yes, but if you have a single interpretation of the Quran, which would allow you to avoid a certain scientific knowledge, that like a scientific knowledge of which we're certain with the text of the Quran, then that doesn't count as a refutation. So in other words, I'm applying a double standard, but it does make sense to apply that double standard. And the reason is because you have an infinite number of sentences which could be false scientific knowledge, and a very, very limited set of sentences which can be certain scientific knowledge. And so the chances of getting something completely wrong are much higher than the chances of getting anything right. And so when you analyze the text, and this is a problem that I found a lot of atheists who try to argue against the Quran scientifically, what they do is they try to argue that the most quote unquote plausible interpretation contradicts with science. That's not good enough, because that depends on what you're reading into the text. As an atheist, you already think it's false, and so you're going to come and tell me this is the most plausible interpretation. Me as a Muslim, I'm going to tell you, no, the most plausible interpretation is the one that doesn't conflict with other certain knowledge that we have, right? Not just what you think is most evident from the text. And so what you do is you do that matching process. You take a scientific theory, you weigh its strength, and then you look at the Quran and you look at all the possible interpretations that you can linguistically derive. And if the Quran is just man-made, it should be very easy for them to find something which, no matter how you read it grammatically, is going to be false. It's false on its face. There's no way around it. It's done. They should be able to do that. They can't. It's very difficult. They can't do it. But the other way, where we find even a single interpretation which would be true, we have dozens of those. So when you look at that both ways, you're looking, okay, so the weight of the evidence is in favor of the Quran.
Yeah, that was a lot to break down, but yeah, I myself have read the Quran, and I've seen the consistencies, especially in the miracles that it claims. You know, some of them actually surprise me a lot. Like how have I never learned about this? And if you look at also, are you familiar with the mathematical miracles of the Quran, like its symmetry and how many times the word is repeated, and it assumes, like, for example, like lunar cycles and stuff?
I've seen some of that. Some of it I think is more convincing, some of it less convincing.
Okay.
Like some of it I think is a bit of a reach, but some of it is really striking. Let's say.
Okay. Yeah. But I think that when it comes to consistency, when you claim that you have deductive consistency, for me, that would require some sort of certainty in all parts of your argument, especially if you're going to claim your belief in your religion on multiple syllogisms, relying on top of one another. But in a way, I see your point that in terms of how we look at the grand scheme of things and consider every category of knowledge that we can have, it all indicates that we have a creator. I would agree with that. But in terms of, I guess, like the Quran itself, Islam, I'm still on the fence about it, but I wouldn't deny it or dismiss it. That's why I'm still on my path of memorizing the Quran myself in Arabic. But yeah, I hope that it's been a great conversation for you, man, because you've talked most of the time, and I just love listening to my guests, especially we're on the roll, they're on the roll or something. And it's been an hour now. And can I give you one last question to end this interview?
Sure, but would you mind if I just commented on some of the things you said there?
Okay.
In terms of having deductive, I don't mean that you can provide a deductively, just based on deduction and something like the premise that something exists, right? That you can prove everything. What I'm saying is that's enough to get you to God. Okay, I believe that you can have a deductive argument for God. Perfectly, really, something that the only empirical, quote unquote, empirical premise that you require is that something exists, which is really an intuitive premise, not an empirical one. But the rest of it, at some stages, you are employing inductive reasoning, you are employing intuitive reasoning. I'm not denying that. I'm simply saying that at no point did I say, for example, that did something that I required, for example, to prove God exists, come bite me in the butt later when I'm talking about ethics, for instance.
Mhm.
You see what I'm trying to say? Whereas with the
Yeah.
atheists, what they're doing is they're switching back and forth depending on the level of the discourse.
Yeah.
For me, I have a consistent system in that way, where nothing in the beginning contradicts anything at the end, and vice versa.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the first. The second, I apologize if I was talking too much. You could have
It's
interrupted me.
okay.
I would have been
It's
happy to
okay.
stop,
I never
but you seem to
interrupt
be
my
nodding
guests.
along, so I was just kind of like, okay.
I find this rule that I never interrupt my guests when they love talking. You know, it's an experience that some would call life changing, actually, or yeah,
No, I
but
enjoy the back and forth. You
yeah.
can interrupt me if there's ever future interviews. You can feel free to interrupt me and press me
Okay.
on a point, and we can go back and forth.
Okay, and one last question, bro. You know,
Sure.
it seems that you have this message to all them atheists who are inconsistent in their worldviews. What would be I guess, your message to them in that how they can analyze their position and look to themselves whether or not what they state politically actually matches the other parts of their belief system?
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that you have to think about how when it comes to your epistemology, when you're coming to be skeptical about another person's worldview, what exactly did you say to refute their worldview?
Yeah.
What exactly did you say? How did you challenge their premises? And then look at your own line of reasoning to get to where you got to, and see whether or not you didn't apply that same standard to your own worldview.
Exactly.
That's very important.
Okay.
And that's kind of, hope I've done that here. Perhaps some atheists at some point, because I was kind of quickly summarizing many different.
Still there, my bro?
Right. I was simply saying to compare that with what they're using to refute other worldviews or deny other worldviews, to see if they're applying that consistently to their own reasoning when they're reasoning about their own worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And what I also said is that because I summarized, let's say, a lot of arguments here, I didn't really go in depth. There are many people watching who probably thought that they found a flaw or massive gaps in the reasoning that I was presenting. And I would invite them to message me on my Facebook page, The Muslim Theist, and we can have a conversation about it. If they thought anything I said didn't make sense or was weak, or they'd like to have a conversation about it, they can feel free to do so.
Awesome. Well, bro, thank you so much for your time, and it's been awesome. Yeah.
Thank you.